Hi ladies. Okay, so welcome to this pretty healthy mind module called Know Your Noggin. Smartly entitled by Jodes, but this is about getting to know your brain and knowing how you can alter its thinking if you know what it's actually doing in the first place. Okay, so we're going to cover emotional and logical thinking, pattern matching and pathways, our nervous systems, our relaxation response, and we're going to talk about taking back control because it's yours anyway. Okay, so how our brains work, it's kind of a vicious cycle when we start talking about how we respond to things. And when I'm talking with clients about this stuff, I think I tend to start in a different place each time because it does go round in a circle and each thing reinforces one of the others. However, we're going to start with how we process information. And please know that this is a really, really basic overview of how our brains work. Science is catching up with stuff. It's learning new stuff about our brain all the time. But really, really basically, it's important to understand what our brain's doing. So whenever we take in any information, so if we see something or hear something or smell something or taste something, it goes up to our brain. It hits a bit of our brain called the thalamus, and then it sends it up to both sides of our brain at the same time. Now, you probably already know that the brain's kind of divided into two hemispheres. Really, really loosely, the right side of our brain is our emotional and creative side, and the left side's our logical side. And that is really loose because there's different parts in each side of the brain that does do different things. But yeah, really basically, our right side is emotional and our left side is logical. Now, the thing is, when any information gets sent up to our brain, it hits the right side of our brain a fraction of a second before our left side. So that means all information is hitting our emotional side first before it hits our logical side. So that means our emotional side of our brain gets to decide what to do with that information. And how it decides depends on how that information is tagged. Okay, so this is where it feeds into pattern matching. So how this works. So for example, say that you see a spider. Okay, the thalamus sends that information up, I've seen a spider, to your brain, and it hits the right side of your brain first. So it hits your emotional side. Now, two different reactions can occur depending on whether or not you are scared of spiders. So whether or not your brain is triggering an emotional response. So if you are scared, your emotional brain, your right side of your brain goes, oh my fucking hell, it's a spider. The pattern match in your brain, which we'll talk about in a bit, says that you're scared of spiders. Okay, so we can see on a brain scan that when your emotional brain is aroused, it sends some signals, sends inhibitory signals over a bit of your brain, kind of like a bridge called the corpus callosum. It sends some signals over to the left logical part of your brain, and we literally see your logical brain switch down, switch off, shut down. So at that point, your emotional brain is completely in control. So people can say to you, Rox, it's just a spider. They don't bite you, they don't hurt you, they don't do anything. Although you can hear that and you recognise that to be true, you are not acting from your logical brain. Your logical brain is not in control. So although you know that to be true, your responses are not based on that information. Yeah? What happens then is you panic and you embed the pattern match even further. So you are kind of reinforcing to your brain that, oh yeah, I'm scared of spiders. Now, this response applies to anything. If you're going to get bad news from a doctor, they'll often say, would you like to bring someone with you? Because the moment they tell you some bad news, it's very likely you'll go emotional. And then the logical stuff that they are telling you doesn't compute. When you're in lust, when you're in the first part of a relationship, you're completely in your emotional brain and you don't notice the things like they chew with their mouth open and all the stuff that will potentially later gross you out. And when you become logical, you will recognise potentially they're not your life partner. But while you're in the lust phase, you're in your emotional brain and your logical brain is not making the decisions. Okay? If you see a spider but you're not scared of them, the information goes to your brain, it hits your emotional brain first, but your emotional brain kind of says, there's no pattern match here, this has got nothing to do with me. So the signal goes to your logical brain, and your logical brain says, oh, okay, I'll get off my butt and get a glass and catch it then. The response that occurs depends entirely on whether the information being transmitted is defined by your brain as emotional or not. Why that's defined makes no difference at this point. If it is defined as emotional, it's processed in a completely different way to if it's defined as logical. Okay, hope that makes sense so far. So, pattern matching is absolutely essential. It's how we function, and it's, I suppose they are, autopilot for loads of things. So often I'll say to a client, when you walk into my office, there's two big comfy chairs. You know, you've never seen them before, but you know they're chairs. That's pattern matching at its most basic. You don't have to feel it and make sure it's safe for you to sit on. You immediately know that's a chair and that's okay. Pattern matching, we would not survive if we didn't have this. And it's now believed that babies form patterns in their brains before they're even born. They already know things and they can already associate things before they're even born. It's completely essential. And it can be awesome. So Jo Malone Orange Blossom perfume immediately takes me back to Mexico where I got married. It's completely my wedding perfume. And I went to my mum's the other day and I went upstairs and I could smell this smell that smelled like my nan's house, how it used to smell when I was little, which my mum was horrified about, but it was gorgeous for me. Some music can take you. Pharrell Williams' Happy reminds me of being pregnant with my first boy. Things can trigger an emotional response in a wonderful way. And that's pattern matching. They associate your brain with a certain time or a certain event, and they can be lovely. But unhealthy or unhelpful pattern matching can be a massive problem. And a description of an unhelpful one is anything that triggers and reinforces a negative feeling and emotion. So it might be that you don't have a great relationship with a certain member of your family, and every time their name's even brought up, it triggers a negative emotion and a feeling. And there is a massive difference between still feeling a feeling and knowing that you don't like that member of a family. There's a massive difference between it being a logical response or an actual emotional response. And you can undo pattern matching. It's a lot of work that I do is around that, and often it's not even recognised that that's what it's going to be around. But some things like anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, especially PTSD is a great example of pattern matching, as there are certain things that trigger and take us back to that stress feeling. So we often think of PTSD as associated with kind of military forces, but something like giving birth definitely can trigger PTSD. I had a lot of therapy after the birth of my first son, and it changed my whole experience. But anything that's kind of a brain-related condition can be and is almost always the result of a pattern matching experience, and an experience that keeps you in the state of emotional arousal. So I could feel exactly what it was like for my first son's birth, and I was reliving those feelings whenever I even thought about the birth of a second child. It's nothing to do with what is practically happening at the time. It's to do with the fact that my thoughts are generating emotions based on past experiences or beliefs. And that is what pattern matching does. Pattern matching is great and essential, but it can also be really, really unhelpful and unhealthy. Okay. So pattern matches are created by the fact that we create pathways in our brain. So our brains are made of neural pathways, and we're making new ones every single time we learn something new. Our brain's described as neuroplastic, which means we have the ability to kind of mold it and make new connections all the time. Also, whenever we repeat things, we're embedding pathways. And now how I often describe this is I describe it as, imagine you're going for a walk and you get to a field and the pathway runs around the edge of the field. Now, that path isn't man-made as such. It's not dug out and tarmacked, but it's made by people walking over it repeatedly, walking over it day in, day out, and eventually that pathway wears down. That's exactly like our brain. When we repeat a behaviour or a saying, if we repeatedly believe a belief, we are embedding a pathway in our brain. Now, say you went for that same walk and you got to the path and you decided, okay, today I'm going to walk straight across the grass. If you just do that once and turn round, you might just about be able to see where you've been, but it doesn't take very long for the grass to spring back up and it's like you were never there. If, however, every single time you go for that walk and you get to that pathway, you decide to cut across the grass, it doesn't take that long before that grass begins to bed down under your feet. And it doesn't take that much longer before an actual pathway starts wearing into that grass. Now, what will happen is if you only go over the new pathway, eventually that will become as embedded a pathway as the old one. But what will have happened in the meantime is that the old pathway will have started to overgrow. All right, so a great example of this is either when you learn to walk or, which you can't remember, or if you've got children, if you learn to watch them walk, they stand up and fall down and stand up and fall down. And at no point do they ever think, oh, forget it, I'm not going to bother learning to walk. I'll be perfectly fine if I just crawl forever. They continue and continue to embed that pathway until that becomes their main pathway and therefore becomes the path of least resistance. So, although you still know how to crawl, you don't do it very often. It's highly unlikely you're going to crawl to work because you've learned a new and better pathway and you allowed that one, the old one, the crawling one, to overgrow. It's still accessible, you can still crawl, but it is by far harder to use than it is to walk. Yeah? Remember when you learned to drive a car? Oh my gosh, I vividly remember sitting there and clinging onto the steering wheel and just not understanding how I could look in my rearview mirror, look in my side mirror, look at the road, move my hand to the gear stick, remember what to do with my feet, use an indicator, put the windscreen wipers on. I vividly remember thinking there's no way it's even possible to do all these things at once. And the pathway wasn't embedded. I had to work really hard until it became second nature. And now, gosh, you can drive and sing to music and talk to friends and read directions and look where you're going. And you can do all these things because the pathway of learning to drive is so embedded. Once they are, they become easy. And the pathways help us make quick decisions about how to do things. So if we had to consciously think of every single thing we did in a day, we couldn't survive. So the idea of being able to tie your shoes or clean your teeth, you don't have to actually think about doing those things. They're just a pathway that's there and it feels like you automatically know how to do it. But at some point you had to learn it. And learning a new skill is super hard. Changing our brain pathways is super hard. Once it's changed, we wonder why we didn't do it ages ago, or we don't ever imagine when it wasn't there. But learning how to think differently is exactly the same as learning a new skill. Okay? And your old way of thinking will always be there, just like crawling is there, but it won't be the first thing that you try to do. Okay. So, how our pattern matchers work is we're constantly scanning the environment to notice things. So we'll notice the weather before we get up without really noticing that we've looked outside. We're constantly scanning the environment and we make patterns without even noticing. And panic attacks is a great example of how patterns get into our brain and pattern matchers get into our brain without us consciously clocking them. So for a panic attack, say that you were walking down the street and a huge bus went by and made a huge noise, and it triggered something in you and made you a bit panicky. Now, whatever that reason is almost doesn't matter at this point. Maybe it was a loud noise, maybe it was a smell from the fumes. It doesn't matter what it was. Whatever it was made you feel panicky. And just say at that exact moment there was a woman with a red coat in front of you. you'd notice that at that point where you went into kind of an anxiety mode, your brain is scanning for threats and it is kind of noticing everything that's around you. It clocked that woman in a red coat. Now say you're at the supermarket and a woman with a red coat cuts in front of you. How pattern matching work is that could easily bring back that same feeling that you felt when the bus went past you. Yeah? You have no conscious idea about this. So at that point, there's nothing you can do about it except notice, oh my gosh, I'm really anxious again. At that point, say there was a tannoy announcement in the supermarket at the same time that you were made to feel anxious by a woman in a red coat. The next time you're in a supermarket, a tannoy announcement goes, that can easily bring back that same anxiety feeling that you felt from seeing the woman in the red coat that was triggered by the bus. What I'm trying to describe is this idea, this is how kind of something like agoraphobia comes about, is because we start tying emotional responses to things in our environment because one thing triggered an emotional response. I hope that makes sense. This is an example of how pattern matching works and how it grows and links to other things. So this is just our brain trying to protect us. So it's kind of noticed I'm in a dangerous situation, or it feels like it's in a dangerous situation. So I'll notice what else is around that could be dangerous, and then I'll warn you about it later. Your brain's trying to protect you. But what's happening is it's putting you in a situation where you're not making logical choices because you're being emotionally aroused. And like I said, sometimes we don't even know what's triggering us, but we can still break the patterns if we know how to respond to them. We don't ever need to figure out what's triggering them. If we know how to respond to the emotional feeling, we can break the pattern. But we also have to be willing to put in the effort to learn a new pathway as well. So what happens when we get triggered emotionally is our sympathetic nervous system triggers our fight, flight or freeze response. And that does tons of things, and there'll be a handout in the downloads area for you about the kind of stuff that it does. But this response is activated by our emotional arousal, and it releases a ton of hormones into our body. These do all sorts of things, and they produce actual physical panic symptoms. So it's not all in your head. Once you have that response that starts in your brain, you can feel actual physical symptoms. So feelings of sick, you might start sweating. These are genuine symptoms that are created by an emotional reaction. Okay? The flip side of that, our other nervous system, is our parasympathetic nervous system, and that evokes our relaxation response. And the really smart thing is, I can teach you how to manipulate it so that we trick your body into moving over to using its parasympathetic nervous system and calming the hell down. This by itself could be the best thing you ever learn if you have any kind of anxiety, if you get stressed, if you are somebody who often can feel emotional but doesn't really know how to deal with it at that point. The point of all of this is knowing how to calm yourself down, because if you can lower your emotional arousal, again, we can see on brain scans that your logical brain starts firing up again. And then when you are back into your logical brain, you can make actual informed decisions. And there is such a small trick that creates this, that makes all of this happen, and it is a breathing technique. And even I groan saying it. Everybody groans when I talk about a breathing technique, but I cannot describe, I wouldn't be telling it you, I cannot describe how effective this is. And it's scientifically backed. There's a reason that we say, God, just breathe when people are stressed. Okay, so a relaxed person breathes in their stomach, not in their chest. And this is really important for a lot of reasons. The two main ones are, if you fill your lungs all the way down to the bottom, that is where the bottom part of your lungs is called the alveoli sacs, and that is where the oxygen passes into the capillaries. So the oxygen goes into our bloodstream at the bottom of our lungs. So if we're not breathing fully and not filling our lungs to the bottom, we're getting far less oxygen into our bloodstream, okay? The other reason is that when we're breathing in our chests, we're doing shorter, shallower breaths. It means we're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide, which sounds like that should be a good thing. But if you've ever seen someone having a panic attack, you might have seen them breathing in a brown paper bag. And the reason for that is that they are breathing back in their own carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is essential because when the oxygen does pass into our bloodstream, if there's not enough carbon dioxide in our body, it can't get off the blood cell that's moving it around. Okay, so the oxygen literally cannot get out of our blood. It can't move into our organs and into our tissues, into our muscles, into our brain specifically, if there's not enough carbon dioxide. So if we're breathing short, shallow breaths, we're not getting enough oxygen and we're breathing out too much carbon dioxide. So we're doubly screwing ourselves over. So relaxed people breathe in their stomach. If you've got a little kid or your partner, if you notice them in bed at night, in a really non-creepy way, if you watch them in bed at night, you will see that it's their stomach that they are breathing in when they're asleep. Okay? You will also see that their breath out is significantly longer than their breath in. Now, when we breathe in, we activate our sympathetic nervous system. When we breathe out, we activate the parasympathetic one. So by forcing our out-breath to be longer than our in-breath, and by breathing in our stomach, we are tricking our body into its relaxation mode. Okay, so there's kind of two rules for this. So the first one is, I want you breathing in your stomach. A really good way to test that is put your hands on your stomach. I'll see if I can make a little video about this, but I put my hands on my stomach with my middle fingers just touching. And the idea is when I breathe in, my middle fingers should come apart. Once you've nailed that, you don't need to do this, but that's a really good way to check that you're breathing in your stomach. And then the second part is to count to 4 as you breathe in and 8 as you breathe out. Now you can count as quickly or as slowly as you like, as long as you're counting at the same speed for your in-breath and your out-breath. And this can take a little bit of practice. Some people get it really quickly. I remember really struggling with this at the beginning. And I remember the very moment that it just clicked for me, and I laid in bed at my old house, and it just clicked, and I could suddenly do this proper breathing technique. It's actually called 7-11 breathing, because the theory is you count to 7 and 11, but that often feels really hard to start with. And 4 and 8 works perfectly well. Just slow it down if you're finding that you've nailed it. All right, so if you do nothing else, pause this video and just have a go for a couple of minutes and genuinely check in how you feel at the beginning and how you feel at the end. The idea of this is if we relax our body, our mind comes back down, our hormones settle down a little bit, and we can move our brain back from emotional brain to logical brain, which is where all our changes happen. Okay, so taking back control. We're in total control of our brains, completely and utterly. However, we just forget it. And our brains are so conditioned, so used to acting on autopilot for us that they act really quickly and they run off down their pathways that you've helped them to build, that you've built. At any point you can pull it back. Any point you can decide to behave differently and make different choices. However, if you're in emotional brain, you won't recognize that you can do that and you won't choose to do that. And that's where it gets tricky, because if you're emotional, you are not logical. Just like you can't argue with an angry person. I've argued some utter bollocks to my husband when I've been angry. There's no point. I'm not logical. It makes no sense. So this is where it gets tricky for people, is remembering that the one thing I have to do when I'm feeling emotional, the one thing I can choose to do when I'm feeling emotional, is go and calm down. Nothing else matters at that point. You can't do anything if you don't go and lower your emotional arousal, okay? So if we're not choosing to behave differently and make different choices, it's because we're engaged in emotional response, yeah? So the 4 things you can do, or the 4 steps to taking back control, is the very first one, and this can be the hardest, is to know when you're acting emotionally. And that idea for me is I've kind of twinned it a little bit with like a visualization. I can when I am feeling emotional, it feels like the right side of my head is sort of full, a bit pulsy, a bit just busy, and I can use that as my trigger to think, oh, okay, I'm a bit emotional right now. And then I use that as my trigger to go and choose to breathe. And although I just said the first step's hardest, actually choosing to go and breathe can be even harder than knowing I'm being emotional. Sometimes I'm being emotional and I choose to stay in that zone. Other times I can choose to go and breathe. Going to choose to do that will calm me down and it lowers the emotional arousal. And then I get to do another choice and choose a logical action. Go write those 4 things down. Start recognizing when you are acting emotionally and go and choose to breathe. Everything else will follow that naturally. And there are times we can override our emotions. So if you are scared of spiders, but your child's there, it's very, very possible to go and catch the spider because your emotion you feel about protecting your child is bigger than the emotion you feel about the spider, potentially. There are lots of situations where we can override our emotions. But to break the patterns and to break the pathways, it's important that we teach our brain that it's not a threat in the first place. So, okay, I can see a spider there. I'm scared of it. I know I'm acting emotionally, so I'm going to sit there. Might be watching it at all times, but I'm going to sit there and I'm going to choose to breathe in my stomach to the count of 4 and 8 until I'm calm enough. And I'll know when I'm calm enough, and it might take a while. And the more you practice it, the less time it will take. But I'm going to choose to sit there until I calm down, and then I'm going to choose to take a logical action. And at first, that logical action might be to kill the poor thing. And until you disconnect the emotional response from the spider, that might be the best step for you. Once you do, it might be that you get braver, you can go and get a glass and catch it. But the whole point of this is recognizing how I lower my emotional arousal. Okay, so I hope that's taught you a heck of a lot about your brain that you didn't know before, and given you some really clear tools on how you can take back your control. Thanks for watching.